I will focus on the legacy of security cooperation, but above all on the low-intensity conflicts that have been in the Philippines and what the American roles have been. And because it is so significant and controversial, I need to say very quickly, I do speak today in no respect as an agent of our Department of Defense. I speak as an independent scholar who's been interested for a long time in the wars in the Philippines. So I can say, I hope, a thing or two that might be controversial, but I'm not speaking for the Pentagon or the center I work for. I want to survey the insurgencies in the Philippines in the last 12 decades and do it briefly and then turn to the equally interesting question of what roles we had as Americans in those fights. So I have kind of two lenses, if you like. The second will be our roles, but the first one is why these things happened at all. I'm interested in ideas, not just history, so I want to know about the causes and the policy ends and objectives of the insurgents that caused the fights we ended up having roles in. So that's the first lens. And it seemed like discontent and economic problems and nationalism and others certainly have been of interest to the Filipinos and causes of revolutions. And I've isolated three: nationalism, communism, and Islamism, by which I don't mean simply Muslim faith, of course. Nationalism comes first, of course, and it arises naturally enough with our ascension into power. Power sure changed quickly in a day or two, didn't it, in Manila Bay in 1898? But just because the islands fell into our laps, it's not true that they came without problems. And we had problems subsequently, and we had to deal with them with armed forces. And so both our Marines and our Army ground forces are of interest, and so too our Navy. Luckily, it is a Navy that's growing at this era. Paul Pedicic has just given us a new book from the Naval Institute Press about the time that Congress and the executive began in the 1880s to really fund a serious Navy. Well, it was unclear initially how the insurgents would face us. Their leader, a natural leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, seemed motivated by two things: nationalism and power. He declared sequential intentions. First, he would promise dictatorship and nothing less during the war so that he could win it. Second, he would stand aside and let others rule in democratic ways. So first war and then peace. First dictatorship and then democracy. The period of the insurgency was then at the end of the 19th century, and it lasted until 1902. It's an important insurgency, and it is truly an insurgency, not simply a spate of terror attacks. They made efforts to administer the areas that they controlled under Aguinaldo in the Philippines, which is to say they didn't always run from a fight. They weren't pure guerrillas. They were insurgents committed to creating government that would outlast these American foreigners. They managed as many as perhaps 100,000 under the most favorable times of the war, but they were defeated. They were defeated by successful counterinsurgency by the U.S., and I'll talk about that. Our views at the time, and you all know this, I've already talked to several experts on Asia here, we were of two minds, and we intended, while conquering the place, to also run it through a sort of mentorship and then turn it free. And paradoxically, by 1934, we denounced as our policy a free Philippines. Nationalism, of course, was never to be completely gone. Nationalism would crop up again and again. And in fact, one of the most interesting things about mid and late 20th century communism is that they used the nationalist lever to try to get power within their own country. Orthodox communists deprecate nationalism. They have to. It's the way the doctrine runs. Orthodox communists are internationalists, but they use nationalism rather successfully at times in their campaign to change government. Well, the second policy end of insurgents in these islands after nationalism has been communism. It emerges as early as the 1930s. In the 40s, it has a role in World War II. And the Haq Balahap insurgents emerged from that war, and they're even partners with the Americans in opposing Japan. And this was a way in which nationalism and communism and pride in the Philippines could all work together. By the time the Haq Balahap developed successfully after World War II, their policy was land for the landless, and more generally, it was a communist government, not the republic the Philippines had after 46. They never spoke, however, of communism explicitly, or almost never, except in their party councils. They used nationalist slogans, and they used winners like land for the landless. Their strategy was interesting to figure out. It certainly wasn't Stalinist and Russia-oriented, although they had institutions, which, for example, they called Stalin University, hidden away in the mountains of Luzon. Their strategy was definitely Maoist-based and rural, based on protracted rural war. And so in this fight in the 50s, we can see the tension that's going to erupt later and divide Peking from Moscow. The guerrillas were perhaps 10,000 during the war. They were not under U.S. control. There was a sort of a friendly rivalry against who could do the most damage to Japanese. But there were problems after the war in this Haq Balahap insurrection against the Republic. The problems included they were terrorizing fellow Filipinos as much as they were anyone else. And second, they no longer had that easy mark of Japan to bash. They had to say they were against their own countrymen in a fight for the future of their own country. And since it was a free republic, that was not easy to do. Well, this insurgency also, the second major one, is defeated. Just as the one had at the early 20th century, the mid-20th century insurgency by communists is defeated by 1955 or so. And we'll describe that in a bit. It's followed by a group that effectively refounds communism and remilitarizes it in the Philippines. In 68 and 69, a man named Sison, Jose Maria Sison, leads a new communist party of a distinctly Maoist cast. He claims to be a nationalist. He is, of course, a good communist, and he's a charismatic individual who's very important. He still writes and still publishes, although he's in exile. He created a new people's army. He gave it rules. He absorbed all the manpower he could in the revolutionary underground, and he tried to prosecute a war which would break the power of the Republic in Manila. He had troubles being a good communist in a place that was largely nationalist, pro-American, Catholic. His literature indicates some of the problems he had reaching his own people. Titles of essays by Sison like this: On the Movement for the Advancement of Nationalism, Cast Away the Labor Aristocrats, On the Counter-Revolutionary Line of the Revisionist Renegades, and on Soviet social imperialists, cooperation with the U.S. in defense and aerospace. So, clearly a Maoist, but not a fool, and rather smart about updating his old communism with new economic figures and facts. As I say, he's still at it, still publishing. I have one or two of his newer books. Now, the reason he's got such a hard time is that, of course, the Marcos regime goes away. It's his best recruiter. The Philippines then, in the 80s, is one in which pride has returned, and republicanism has returned, and liberty has returned. I got to be in the visitors gallery of the House of Representatives in Washington in September of '86 when Cory Aquino spoke after having won the presidency. And it was astonishing to see the reception she got. There was a thunderous applause that went on and on and on, and she had not yet said a word. And so that old fealty between the two people showed well, and no one was happier than us that democracy had replaced dictatorship back in the Philippines. But for them, for the communists, it was a different story. They still wanted power. They were going to fight in the jungle, but also in the streets and also in Parliament. So they had a national democratic front, which was and is very important. A good insurgency works on a couple levels. The overt political, that's the National Front. The covert political, they did that well. The military, they did that adequately well. And so in that three ways, they fought their battles and kept their power. And at one time, they had something like 25,000 armed guerrillas. But they had weaknesses too, always short of guns. The problem that Sison, the best leader, was trapped in Dutch exile. They haven't fared well. The third cause in the regime, the third cause of insurrection in the Philippines, and then I'm going to double back and go through some of the U.S. efforts, and that's Islamism. And it doesn't have immense power, but it's been very consequential and still is, and it's making headlines now in the country. Islamism blends the Moros as a people, religion, of course, and vehement politics, and the sort of vehement politics that Islamism showed elsewhere in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In his book, The Muslim South and Beyond, an author named Samuel Tan writes about the Moros, a kind of collective name for traditional groupings. And he says their drive for autonomy is inseparably linked to geography. And for many of them it is. And so there has been already an autonomous region for many in the Philippines. I sketched it and darkened those sections on the map on the back of your outline there. It's not, as many of us think, a large part of Mindanao. It's just part of it. And it includes several islands. The smallest island there on the far left is Tawi-Tawi, and that's the scene just a day or two ago of the latest attempt by one of these Islamist groups, Abu Sayyaf, to take hostages. They successfully stopped a Korean ship and took hostages. So Manila's policy in all these things is one of integration. And the Moros, for their part, prefer autonomy and have been willing to fight for it, especially after 1972, 1973. They hoped for a semi-autonomous zone they could run, and they got it too. They got it. It's called the ARM for short. And so all the discussion you're seeing now in the paper about the Bangsamoro Pact is simply phase two. It's with a different group. We could talk about this in Q&A. But it's a different phase of a similar arrangement of semi-autonomy for the Moro peoples in Mindanao. Now, Manila's counterinsurgency and all this has been with its own forces, and the U.S. Has not engaged at all in those kinds of fights. We do worry a great deal about the internationalist-minded types like Abu Sayyaf and Ansar Khalifa Philippines, Islamist groups which have sort of passed out of the borders of the Philippines and into international lanes and international terrorist attacks. So that's the first lens. Why have we had fights? And I'm probably doing injustice, but I chose three groupings of nationalism, communism, and then Islamism. All have had a continuous thread through the last 12 decades. The second lesson then is the one Americans are especially interested in, which is what we've been doing about all this. Of course, the way we inherit the islands and act in them initially is as a colonial power. And so it's no surprise to any of you when you see emergent hostility at times from Manila or other Filipino actors, which has to do with angry talk about colonialism or neo-colonialism. That's a reality. and all the old history books, credible and otherwise, speak truthfully, I think, of trade arrangements and others which are deemed unfortunate and perhaps prejudicial. It's a difficult question, which I'm not an expert, but there's general understanding that there's natural causes for the anti-colonialism of the Philippines. It's interesting that that man, Emilio Aguinaldo, who we captured in the very first of the wars I discussed, he wrote a couple of books later which were quite favorable to his captors, to the United States. Aguinaldo said, among other things, that after all, it was under U.S. authority that a bunch of Catholic land estates were purchased and then divided for small farms after 1900. And secondly, that U.S. trade caused the Filipino economy to boom because of our heavy engagement, our provision to them of markets, and the fact that we had such special low tariffs for the Philippines. And those two testaments are again from the man who led the nationalist insurgency against us. So they're sort of interesting. Well, that military presence, of course, was very strong. We invaded with several tens of thousands of troops. At one point, it was as much as 65 or 70,000. An enormous number of Americans were there. Initially, mostly volunteers, increasingly Federals and conscripts. It meant we could do lots of garrisoning of the country to reassure, to maintain order, and to show presence. From 50 or so, it rose to perhaps 500 eventually. We had troops everywhere. Our policy for this kind of deployment took a while to develop and eventually emerged as, quote, benevolent assimilation. We were going to benevolently assimilate the Philippines into the United States. And yet some of our actions were discordant with that. And so all the history books mention a certain amount of brutality in the campaign, especially on Samar and some other places. In the war, the Navy was engaged as well. The Navy transported their brethren of the land forces to and from the many islands and made all the logistical things possible to support those fights, including the expedition to Samar, which supported the famous Littleton Waller's enterprise there with Marines. They had some other roles involving their big guns as we developed our Navy. The USS Oregon, I understand, was key to one engagement on Luzon, where naval fires were key to the battle and to killing a young general, Pilar, who was a brilliant young leader of insurgents. There were some other joint operations, including one involving the U.S. Army's 24th Infantry Division. The service collaboration I like most, and a story I want to tell, is one that really helped bring the war to a close. It's one of the most astonishing stories about decapitation of an insurgent group that there is in modern times, and yet it's really been forgotten. This was the brainchild of a brigadier named Frederick Funston. I'll bet some of you know him. He wrote absolutely glittering memoirs, The Memories of Two Wars, and I urge you to have a look sometime. A wonderful book. Funston got the idea that he could hunt the leader, Aguinaldo, if he created a fake guerrilla gang, a pseudo-gang. This has happened in other counterinsurgencies, but this is one of the first modern cases. So he took a bunch of Makibiti scouts and he put them all in guerrilla-style clothing, gave them their sorts of weapons, trained them what to say and what not to say, and the kind of lingo they ought to use. And then he had still a problem, though, because while you can infiltrate perhaps an insurgent's headquarters with some reinforcements, how do you explain a white guy like Frederick Funston being with him? So he created a scenario in which he and several other American officers had been captured by this group, and they would thus present themselves as reinforcements to Aguinaldo and perhaps get to catch him. And the bait, in part, was these American officers who were captives. In fact, they were the leaders. It was a brilliant little thing. I could talk some about the details. The Vicksburg, one of the ships there, and Commodore Barry of the U.S. Navy made the insertion of this interesting party of perhaps 85, and they made a terribly difficult long march through parts of Luzon and arrived almost starving at Aguinaldo's headquarters, whereupon he greeted them warmly and they pounced on him. He was brought back to Manila within days and presented in the palace in Manila. After that, the insurgency pretty much collapsed. It did take till the next year to capture the final two major leaders, and by '02, midsummer, Teddy Roosevelt could pronounce that the war had ended. Well, the legacy of this is a great one that shows us what potency there is in these pseudo-operations, but also it's in the notion of working as outsiders with locals who are greatly competent and spirited and know their own country really well. Aguinaldo made that argument in one of the books he wrote, and he quoted General James Van Fleet saying the same thing. And he thought it was one of the great lessons of the war, and I think it has been. And I think it explains the next step. And that is that after World War II, a half century later, 1902 to the 50s, when presented with the challenge of how to help the Philippines as a republic protect itself against internal communist guerrillas, the Hucks, the U.S. policy was distinctly reserved and limited. We were in an economy of force mode because we were not interested in a war, but also deeply involved in one in Korea. And so it made it easy to avoid further commitments to the Philippines. Now, the smartest man in all this, I think, was maybe Edward Lansdale, a guy you know, winning personality. He represented defense and state and our intelligence all at the same time. He was a mystery man at the time, highly effective, and historians now look back on him somewhat coldly, I'm afraid. Stanley Carnell, Peter Sales, others I could mention, are very critical of Lansdale. I met some of the critics when I taught at the Naval War College, and I was always on Lansdale's side myself. The key to the Lansdale operation, though, was not just the skills of one advisor or spy. It was his close partnership with a great man in Philippine history, Ramon Magsaysay. He'd been a Huck himself, so he understood guerrilla war. He was a serious, practical man. He ran a bus company, of all things, after the war. He became a congressman, then quickly defense secretary, and then soon thereafter president of the Philippines. A remarkable, charismatic, and truly democratic man at heart. He thought, as did Lansdale, that the U.S. could well stay in reserve, in effect, provide some technical help, some platforms, very minimum of weapons, lots of good advice. And so Magsaysay fought the war, not on his own, but with a very limited American help. And what he did was marvelous because he truly thought in grand strategy terms. How often we hear that, how rarely we actually see it. Who in Washington can explain what our grand strategy against ISIS is? Maybe a few, not too many. Magsaysay understood that if the land for the landless slogan was that important to the Hucks, he needed to deal with it. So he and Lansdale developed an idea called EDCOR, which was to take some virgin lands and basically give them to farmers and some retired soldiers, but above all, Hucks who would quit. The invitation to quit was dropped from airplanes, and if you held in your hand a flyer from EDCOR, as a Huck, it was like a death sentence on your own head. It was that disturbing to the communist underground that you, as a good cadre, might defect to take one of these farms that EDCOR was offering. So it was highly effective psychological war, even though economically the footprint of these little farms really was not very great. He also knew elections had a sense of decline from the ideals evinced in the Constitution, and so he took measures to make them especially safe. And they invented at that time an entity you still know called NAMFREL, which is a kind of citizens volunteer organization to try to keep elections. The Army, to get them to refocus and really get good at small unit tactics and intelligence and stuff that really matters in a war among your own people. He did those and many, many other things, including the use of pseudo-gangs now and then, and a lot of other psychological stuff. He and Lansdale developed the idea of so-called civic action, which we now take to be routine, military performance of helpful duties among citizenry. He did a lot of other things that were quite striking, and I think quite successful. Well, today, then he defeats the insurgency by the time of 1954 or 1955. In terms of today, when we think about our relationship with this country, we deal with another form of extremely limited warfare, because for the last decades, the New People's Army and the communists have remained a concern to the Philippines, extremely important. But it's a declining threat, because our efforts have been to help professionalize the Philippine Armed Services, provision them here and there in limited ways. We could talk more about that. And to get them to be able to do a better job at suppressing their own communist guerrillas. The New People's Army is now down to perhaps 4,000, maybe less, and they're probably fairly discouraged, or at least they have been until present. I can't predict what will happen under the new president and how he will pursue the war against NPA. I can make the observation that when you meet military officers from the Philippines, most of them have spent their careers worried about the New People's Army and not guys like Abu Sayyaf. It's been a serious internal challenge. Well, for now, I think what we'll see is a continuation of a conviction in Washington that we shouldn't be in combat there. We rarely have been. We've been closely involved in only one or two parts of various campaigns. We never want to see ground troops committed there. Manila has always been, similarly, determined to keep us to the side, keep our support, but never allow us to look like a imperialist or think like one. So there's actually been a very good working relationship these last several decades. Even while we contributed against Abu Sayyaf, we tried to do so technically and with signals intelligence and lots of other things that did not involve American special forces on the ground. We did have a commitment there. It rose to a number of as many as 600 advisors in the Southern campaign, and that wound down 18 months ago. We've never taken a combat role against the New People's Army, and we've never taken a combat role against the Moros I discussed, who are presently working for Samora Rima. So what we have done is provision a certain amount of technical stuff, including things for the police, who are increasingly important because the counterinsurgency mission is passing to the police from the military, or at least it was under the last president, Benigno Aquino. Base access is obviously important. It was only about a year ago or two that there was final settlement on terms which would expand U.S. base access. The Supreme Court held it up for a while. Now we might see a demand for its repudiation, perhaps, by the new president. So much is left unknown about that. It had called for continuing ship visits. It had called for continuing training. And there was one or two new things of interest. Greater access to Subic Bay, a place we left, you remember, in '91, all except a few cases. And even a new anchorage on the outside, that is the west, of Palawan, the Long Island, which, by the way, faces the South China Sea. That was going to be extremely important, and it was a hallmark of the new relationship, in stronger relationship, which the last president thought he was achieving with the United States. Benigno Aquino, of course, goes out 30 June, and he's gone now. Other simple forms of aid have also continued, as in counterterrorism. But what we're seeing now then is a total reevaluation by both sides under strange and somewhat disturbing circumstances. We're now seeing rhetorical hot lava in the air. We're seeing smoke, we're seeing sizzling in the water, and we're all trying to decide how long this will go on and whether it will amount to much. I'm convinced that those 70 years of independence, the fealty they feel for Americans, and many other things, including naked self-interest vis-a-vis China, are going to keep most Filipinos thinking as they have, and not thinking with the new president. Indeed, there's increasing evidence in the newspapers that what the president says is not at all what many of his officials think. So he may have his own struggle within his own administration. So where do we end? We're all nervous at the moment about this long bilateral relationship. But I think what I want to end with is conviction that we do share a very strong vision of democracy and security. We often have. Strange examples. Aguinaldo, the defeated insurgent, writing in his own books about the great value in the Bill of Rights, which they copied from us, and the way in which the American values are superior to that of the Spanish Empire, which he knew in his own day. And the beauty he saw, the intellectual beauty he saw in formal instructions issued by President McKinley about the future of the Philippines. Ed Lansdale, that sort of well-spirited man who spoke so eloquently about the Filipinos' future and managed to speak in detail about his own ideals for democracy. He liked the country in part because he felt were democratic. And he was a true believer and wrote about that in many essays. I have some of his speeches to American forces, like at various military camps, and Fort Bragg. And he was a real partisan of democracy. And he felt that in a nastiest of guerrilla wars, it was a glue and a motivator that was truly powerful. He was a believer in the way that someone like Tom Paine was a believer. And it makes him valuable to read. We've seen that someone like Cory Aquino can share our ideals. She did not say that this is a foreign ideology any more than you or I think that we need to wear togas to express some of the democratic values the Greeks showed. Right? She thought that democracy works for the Filipinos because it suits them and because it's intelligent and reasonable. And the Americans liked her so much in part for those reasons. And so I think as we struggle with the problems out there, some corruption, too narrow a political base, weaknesses maybe of other kinds, the vigilantism which the new president has openly encouraged, which is of course utterly contrary to the rule of law. I think that we're likely to survive all of that, and that the Philippines will retain its democratic bearings in the end. And so, for me, just speaking for myself as I have for this past half hour, my vision for their future involves very sober ideas, and it involves remembering people like Ramon Magsaysay. Not far from our embassy in Manila, there's a Magsaysay Foundation, and inside its courtyard, a beautiful metal statue of that president from the 1950s. And I stood there once and was really impressed by an inscription on a plaque. And it turns out this was what he called his credo. He prepared it during his presidency. He announced it early on and then lived by it. And I think it's marvelous. And what's interesting, well, it's kind of like Frederick Funston's exploit. It's a great moment which is utterly forgotten, but somehow speaks to me today. Magsaysay's credo doesn't even make it into a new thick biography about his life, only a few parts of it. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's not too long. The president said that he stood for these things. I believe that government starts at the bottom and moves upward, for government exists basically for the welfare of the masses of the nation. I believe that he who has less in life should have more in law. I believe that the little man is fundamentally entitled to a little more food in his stomach, a little more clothing on his back, and a little more roof over his head. I believe that this nation is endowed with a vibrant and stout heart and possesses untapped capabilities and incredible resiliency. I believe that a high and unwavering sense of morality should pervade all spheres of government activity. I believe that the pulse of government should be strong and steady, and the men at the helm imbued with missionary zeal. I believe in the majesty of constitutional and legal processes, in the inviolability of human rights. I believe that the free world is collectively strong and that there is neither need nor reason to compromise the dignity of man. I believe that communism is iniquity, as is the violence it does to produce the principles of Christianity. I believe that the president should set the example of a big heart, an honest mind, sound instincts, the virtue of healthy impatience, and an abiding love for the common man. So that's his credo in 10 verses. Those are the words of a statesman, a winner of 2 wars. That's Ramon Magsaysay. So they've had many presidents out there in the Philippines, but that's the one that I want to add to our thoughts today. Thank you.
Questions?
Questions, of course. Sir.
Sir, my name is Tom Brown. I'm from the San Francisco Commander. Can you tell us what led up to the election of the current president?
Well, Aquino was well respected, and there are many domestic political factors I can't assess. There were some problems in the country, corruption being endemic, the drug gangs being another example, the persistence of a couple of insurgencies. Peace talks going pretty well with most Moros, but the Islamist terrorists I mentioned still operative, the New People's Army still in the field, and especially I think the notion of corruption and drugs, which go together for him. A great writer on Vietnam, Al Santoli, the Institute of World Politics, has told me that he believes that this sort of all-out war against the druggies is connected directly to the conviction in the Philippines in this administration that some of the judiciary is corrupt and some of the police are corrupt, and that therefore all these things are connected, and that's why Rodrigo Duterte is willing to be so ruthless as to have his police, in some cases, shoot first in drug deals, and even going so far as to exhort others to use their weapons and hunt down the drug dealers. And that it's the old thing in dictatorship sort of actions. You can always get some results if you're willing to be that ruthless, and he is. And a lot have been killed, and a lot of others are turning themselves in because they don't like the odds anymore. And so there'll be some nodding and some approval from some. But overall, this is kind of very corrosive. This is highly corrosive in any civil society. One can only imagine if we faced up to the fact of systematic murders in Chicago by urging all good citizens of Illinois to arm up and go into the city and take care of them gangs. So I think that there will be a relapse of interest in this. People will increasingly be counting bodies. Some will be found to be totally innocent. There will be a sense of damage to the justice system, so that the very effort to undergird the system with some real force may rebound, and a lot of Filipinos may be unhappy with it. But there's all those domestic sentiments seething. Now, what about the far left? That's one of the mysteries for me. There's only one report on this, and I don't even know if I should mention it, but there's a report that actually Jose Marie Sison not only wants to come home from exile in Holland, he's in Utrecht, but that he knows Duterte, and greeted his presidency by sending him some of his books on communism. And this would be a weird sort of left-right collusion, maybe. And I don't know if CSON will be invited home. I don't know if the war against the New People's Army will be continued. But it's a bizarre thing now, just a coincidence, I'm sure he would say, to have a rather soft hand on the issues of the New People's Army with a new opening to China when CSON is a Maoist.